Not to go on all fours, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to suck up drink, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to eat fish or flesh, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to claw the bark of trees, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to chase other men, that is the law. Are we not men? And so, from the prohibition of these acts of folly, on to the prohibition of what I thought then were the maddest, most impossible, and most indecent things one could well imagine. A kind of rhythmic fervour fell on all of us. We gabbed and swayed faster and faster, repeating this amazing law. Superficially, the contagion of these brutes was upon me, but deep down within me the laughter and disgust struggled together. We ran through a long list of prohibitions, and then the chant swung round to a new formula. His is the house of pain. His is the hand that makes. His is the hand that wounds. His is the hand that heals. And so on for another long series, mostly quite incomprehensible gibberish to me about him, whoever he might be. I could have fancied it was a dream, but never before have I heard chanting in a dream. His is the lightning flash, we sang. His is the deep salt sea. A horrible fancy came into my head that Moreau, after animalizing these men, had infected their dwarfed brains with a kind of deification of himself. However, I was too keenly aware of white teeth and strong claws about me to stop my chanting on that account. His are the stars in the sky. At last that song ended. I saw the ape-man's face shining with perspiration, and my eyes being now accustomed to the darkness, I saw more distinctly the figure in the corner from which the voice came. It was the size of a man, but it seemed covered with a dull grey hair, almost like a Skye terrier. What was it? What were they all? Imagine yourself surrounded by all the most horrible cripples and maniacs it is possible to conceive, and you may understand a little of my feelings with these grotesque caricatures of humanity about me. "He is a 5-man, a 5-man, like me," said the ape-man. I held out my hands. The grey creature in the corner leant forward. "Not to run on all fours, that is the law. Are we not men?" he said. He put out a strangely distorted talon and gripped my fingers. The thing was almost like the hoof of a deer produced into claws. I could have yelled with surprise and pain. His face came forward and peered at my nails, came forward into the light of the opening of the hut, and I saw with a quivering disgust that it was like the face of neither man nor beast, but a mere shock of grey hair, with 3 shadowy overarchings to mark the eyes and mouth. "He has little nails," said this grisly creature in his hairy beard. "It is well." He threw my hand down, and instinctively I gripped my stick. "Eat roots and herbs. It is his will," said the ape-man. "I am the sayer of the law," said the grey figure. "Here come all that be new to learn the law. I sit in the darkness and say the law." "It is even so," said one of the beasts in the doorway. "Evil are the punishments of those who break the law. None escape." "None escape," said the beast-folk, glancing furtively at one another. "None," said the ape-man. "None escape. See, I did a little thing, a wrong thing, once. I jabbered, stopped talking. None could understand. I am burnt, branded in the hand. He is great, he is good. None escape," said the grey creature in the corner. "None escape," said the beast people, looking askance at one another. "For every one the want that is bad," said the great sayer of the law. "What you will want we do not know. We shall know. Some want to follow things that move, to watch and slink and wait and spring, to kill and bite, bites deep and rich, sucking the blood. It is bad. Not to chase other men, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to eat flesh or fish, that is the law. Are we not men? None escape, said a dappled brute standing in the doorway. For every one the want is bad, said the grey sayer of the law. Some want to go tearing with teeth and hands into the roots of things, snuffing into the earth. It is bad. None escape, said the men in the door. Some go clawing trees, some go scratching at the graves of the dead, some go fighting with foreheads or feet or claws, some bite suddenly, none giving occasion. Some love uncleanness. None escape, said the ape-man, scratching his calf. None escape, said the little pink sloth creature. Punishment is sharp and sure. Therefore, learn the law. Say the words. And incontinently he began again the strange litany of the law. And again I and all these creatures began singing and swaying. My head reeled with this jabbering and the close stench of the place, but I kept on, trusting to find presently some chance of a new development. Not to go on all fours, that is the law. Are we not men? We were making such a noise that I noticed nothing of a tumult outside until someone, who I think was one of the two swine-men I had seen, thrust his head over the little pink sloth creature and shouted something excitedly, something that I did not catch. Incontinently those at the opening of the hut vanished. My ape-man rushed out. The thing that had sat in the dark followed him. I only observed that it was big and clumsy, and covered with silvery hair, and I was left alone. Then, before I reached the aperture, I heard the yelp of a staghound. In another moment I was standing outside the hovel, my chair-rail in my hand, every muscle of me quivering. Before me were the clumsy backs of perhaps a score of these beast-people, their misshapen heads half hidden by their shoulder-blades. They were gesticulating excitedly. Other half-animal faces glared interrogation out of the hovels. Looking in the direction in which they faced, I saw, coming through the haze under the trees beyond the end of the passage of dens, the dark figure and awful white face of Moreau. He was holding the leaping staghound back, and close behind him came Montgomery, revolver in hand. For a moment I stood horror-struck. I turned and saw the passage behind me blocked by another heavy brute, with a huge grey face and twinkling little eyes, advancing towards me. I turned and saw the passage behind me blocked by another heavy brute, with a huge grey face and twinkling little eyes, advancing towards me. I looked round and saw to the right of me, and a half-dozen yards in front of me, a narrow gap in the wall of rock, through which a ray of light slanted into the shadows. "Stop!" cried Moreau as I strode towards him, and then, "Hold him!" At that, first one face turned towards me, and then others. Their bestial minds were happily slow. I dashed my shoulder into a clumsy monster who was turning to see what Moreau meant, and flung him forward into another. I felt his hands fly round, clutching at me and missing me. The little pink sloth creature dashed at me, and I gashed down its ugly face with the nail in my stick, and in another minute was scrambling up a steep side pathway, a kind of sloping chimney out of the ravine. I heard a howl behind me, and cries of "Catch him! Hold him!" and a grey-faced creature appeared behind me and jammed his huge bulk into the cleft. "Go on!" they howled. I clambered up the narrow cleft in the rock, and came out upon the sulphur on the west side of the village of the beast-men. That gap was altogether fortunate for me, for the narrow chimney, slanting obliquely upward, must have impeded the nearer pursuers. I ran over the white space and down a steep slope, through a scattered growth of trees, and came to a low-lying stretch of tall reeds, through which I pushed into a dark, thick undergrowth that was black and succulent underfoot. As I plunged into the reeds, my foremost pursuers emerged from the gap. I broke my way through this undergrowth for some minutes. The air behind me and about me was soon full of threatening cries. I heard the tumult of my pursuers in the gap up the slope, then the crashing of the reeds, and every now and then the crackling crash of a branch. Some of the creatures roared like excited beasts of prey. The staghound yelped to the left. I heard Moreau and Montgomery shouting in the same direction. I turned sharply to the right. It seemed to me even then that I heard Montgomery shouting for me to run for my life. Presently the ground gave rich and oozy under my feet. But I was desperate and went headlong into it, struggled through knee-deep, and so came to a winding path among tall canes. The noise of my pursuers passed away to my left. In one place 3 strange, peak-hopping animals, about the size of cats, bolted before my footsteps. This pathway ran uphill, across another open space covered with white incrustation, and plunged into a canebrake again. Then suddenly it turned parallel with the edge of a steep-walled gap, which came without warning, like the ha-ha of an English park, turned with an unexpected abruptness. I was still running with all my might, and I never saw this drop until I was flying headlong through the air. I fell on my forearms and head among thorns, and rose with a torn ear and bleeding face. I had fallen into a precipitous ravine, rocky and thorny, full of a hazy mist which drifted about me in wisps, and with a narrow streamlet from which this mist came meandering down the centre. I was astonished at this thin fog in the full blaze of daylight, but I had no time to stand wondering then. I turned to my right, downstream, hoping to come to the sea in that direction, and so have my way open to drown myself. It was only later I found that I had dropped my nailed stick in my fall. Presently the ravine grew narrower for a space, and carelessly I stepped into the stream. I jumped out again pretty quickly, for the water was almost boiling. I noticed, too, there was a thin sulphurous scum drifting upon its coiling water. Almost immediately came a turn in the ravine and the indistinct blue horizon. The nearer sea was flashing the sun from a myriad facets. I saw my death before me. But I was hot and panting, with the warm blood oozing out on my face and running pleasantly through my veins. I felt more than a touch of exultation, too, at having distanced my pursuers. It was not in me then to go out and drown myself yet. I stared back the way I had come. I listened. Save for the hum of the gnats and the chirp of some small insects that hopped among the thorns, the air was absolutely still. Then came the yelp of a dog, very faint, and a chattering and gibbering, the snap of a whip, and voices. They grew louder, then fainter again. The noise receded up the stream and faded away. For a while the chase was over, but I knew now how much hope of help for me lay in the Beast People. End of Part 4. Part 5 of The Island of Doctor Moreau. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. A Parley. I turned again and went on down towards the sea. I found the hot stream broadened out to a shallow, weedy sand, in which an abundance of crabs and long-bodied, many-legged creatures started from my footfall. I walked to the very edge of the salt water, and then I felt I was safe. I turned and stared, arms akimbo, at the thick green behind me, into which the steamy ravine cut like a smoking gash. But, as I say, I was too full of excitement and, a true saying, though those who have never known danger may doubt it, too desperate to die. Then it came into my head that there was one chance before me yet. While Moreau and Montgomery and their bestial rabble chased me through the island, might I not go round the beach until I came to their enclosure, make a flank march upon them, in fact, and then, with a rock lugged out of their loosely built wall, perhaps smash in the lock of the smaller door, and see what I could find, knife, pistol, or what not, to fight them with when they returned. It was, at any rate, something to try. So I turned to the westward and walked along by the water's edge. The setting sun flashed his blinding heat into my eyes. The slight Pacific tide was running in with a gentle ripple. Presently the shore fell away southward, and the sun came round upon my right hand. Then, suddenly, far in front of me, I saw first one and then several figures emerging from the bushes, Moreau with his grey staghound, then Montgomery, and two others. At that I stopped. They saw me, and began gesticulating and advancing. I stood watching them approach. The two beast-men came running forward to cut me off from the undergrowth, inland. Montgomery came, running also, but straight towards me. Moreau followed slower with his dog. At last I roused myself from my inaction, and turning seaward, walked straight into the water. The water was very shallow at first. I was 30 yards out before the waves reached my waist. Dimly I could see the intertidal creatures darting away from my feet. "What are you doing, man?" cried Montgomery. I turned, standing waist-deep, and stared at them. Montgomery stood panting at the margin of the water. His face was bright red with exertion, his long flaxen hair blown about his head, and his dropping nether lip showed his irregular teeth. Moreau was just coming up, his face pale and firm, and the dog at his hand barked at me. Both men had heavy whips. Farther up the beach stared the beast-men. "What am I doing? I'm going to drown myself," said I. Montgomery and Moreau looked at each other. "Why?" asked Moreau. "Because that is better than being tortured by you." "I told you so," said Montgomery, and Moreau said something in a low tone. "What makes you think I shall torture you?" asked Moreau. "What I saw," I said, "and those yonder." "Hush!" said Moreau, and held up his hand. "I will not," said I. "They were men. What are they now? I, at least, will not be like them." I looked past my interlocutors. Up the beach were Emling, Montgomery's attendant, and one of the white-swathed brutes from the boat. Farther up, in the shadow of the trees, I saw my little ape-man, and behind him some other dim figures. "Who are these creatures?" said I, pointing to them and raising my voice more and more that it might reach them. "They were men like yourselves, whom you have infected with some bestial taint, men whom you have enslaved, and whom you still fear." "You who listen," I cried, pointing now to Moreau and shouting past him to the beast-men, "you who listen, do you not see these men still fear you, go in dread of you? Why then do you fear them? You are many." "For God's sake," cried Montgomery, "stop that, Prendick." "Prendick!" cried Moreau. They both shouted together as if to drown my voice, and behind them lowered the staring faces of the beast-men, wondering, their deformed hands hanging down, their shoulders hunched up. They seemed, as I fancied, to be trying to understand me, to remember, I thought, something of their human past. I went on shouting. I scarcely remember what. That Moreau and Montgomery could be killed, that they were not to be feared. That was the burden of what I put into the heads of the beast people. I saw the green-eyed man in the dark rags, who had met me on the evening of my arrival, come out from among the trees, and others followed him, to hear me better. At last, for want of breath, I paused. "Listen to me for a moment," said the steady voice of Moreau, "and then say what you will." "Well?" said I. He coughed, thought, then shouted, "Latin, Prendick! Bad Latin, schoolboy Latin, but try and understand. He non sunt homines, sunt animalia, qui nos habemus vivisected. A humanizing process. I will explain. Come ashore." I laughed. "A pretty story," said I. "They talk, build houses. They were men. It's likely I'll come ashore. The water just beyond where you stand is deep and full of sharks." "That's my way," said I, "short and sharp, presently. Wait a minute." He took something out of his pocket that flashed back the sun, and dropped the object at his feet. "That's a loaded revolver," said he. "Montgomery here will do the same. Now, we are going up the beach until you are satisfied the distance is safe. Then come and take the revolvers." "Not I. You have a third between you. I want you to think over things, Prendick. In the first place, I never asked you to come upon this island. If we vivisected men, we should import men, not beasts. In the next, we had you drugged last night, had we wanted to work you any mischief. And in the next, now your first panic is over and you can think a little, is Montgomery here quite up to the character you give him? We have chased you for your good, because this island is full of inimical phenomena. Besides, why should we want to shoot you when you have just offered to drown yourself? Why did you set your people onto me when I was in the hut? We felt sure of catching you and bringing you out of danger. Afterwards we drew away from the scent for your good." I mused. It seemed just possible. Then I remembered something again. "But I saw," said I, "in the enclosure. That was a puma." "Look here, Prendick," said Montgomery, "you're a silly ass. Come out of the water and take these revolvers and talk. We can't do anything more than we could do now. I will confess that then, and indeed always, I distrusted and dreaded Moreau. But Montgomery was a man I felt I understood." "Go up the beach," said I after thinking, and added, "holding your hands up." "Can't do that," said Montgomery, with an explanatory nod over his shoulder. "Undignified." "Go up to the trees, then," said I, "as you please." "It's a damned silly ceremony," said Montgomery. Both turned and faced the 6 or 7 grotesque creatures who stood there in the sunlight, solid, casting shadows, moving, and yet so incredibly unreal. Montgomery cracked his whip at them, and forthwith they all turned and fled helter-skelter into the trees, and when Montgomery and Moreau were at a distance I judged sufficient, I waded ashore, and picked up and examined the revolvers. To satisfy myself against the subtlest trickery, I discharged one at a round lump of lava, and had the satisfaction of seeing the stone pulverized and the beach splashed with lead. Still I hesitated for a moment. "I'll take the risk," said I, "at last," and with a revolver in each hand I walked up the beach towards them. "That's better," said Moreau without affectation. "As it is, you have wasted the best part of my day with your confounded imagination." And with a touch of contempt which humiliated me, he and Montgomery turned and went on in silence before me. The knot of beast-men, still wondering, stood back among the trees. I passed them as serenely as possible. One started to follow me, but retreated again when Montgomery cracked his whip. The rest stood silent, watching. They may once have been animals, but I never before saw an animal trying to think. Chapter 14. Dr. Moreau Explains. "And now, Prendick, I will explain," said Dr. Moreau, so soon as we had eaten and drunk. "I must confess that you are the most dictatorial guest I ever entertained. I warn you that this is the last I shall do to oblige you. The next thing you threaten to commit suicide about, I shan't do, even at some personal inconvenience. He sat in my deck-chair, a cigar half consumed in his white, dexterous-looking fingers. The light of the swinging lamp fell on his white hair. He stared through the little window out at the starlight. I sat as far away from him as possible, the table between us, and the revolvers to hand. Montgomery was not present. I did not care to be with the two of them in such a little room. "You admit that the vivisected human being, as you called it, is, after all, only a puma?" said Moreau. He had made me visit that horror in the inner room to assure myself of its inhumanity. "It is the puma," I said, "still alive, but so cut and mutilated as I pray I may never see living flesh again. Of all vile—" "Never mind that," said Moreau. "At least spare me those youthful horrors. Montgomery used to be just the same. You admit that it is the puma. Now be quiet while I reel off my physiological lecture." And forthwith, beginning in the tone of a man supremely bored, but presently warming a little, he explained his work to me. It was very simple and convincing. Now and then there was a touch of sarcasm in his voice. Presently I found myself hot with shame at our mutual positions. The creatures I had seen were not men, had never been men. They were animals, humanized animals, triumphs of vivisection. "You forget all that a skilled vivisector can do with living things," said Moreau. "For my own part, I'm puzzled why the things I have done here have not been done before. Small efforts, of course, have been made. Amputation, tongue-cutting, excisions. Of course, you know a squint may be induced or cured by surgery. Then, in the course of excisions, you have all kinds of secondary changes, pigmentary disturbances, modifications of the passions, alterations in the secretion of fatty tissue. I have no doubt you have heard of these things." "Of course," said I. "But these foul creatures of yours—" "All in good time," said he, waving his hand at me. "I am only beginning. Those are trivial cases of alteration. Surgery can do better things than that. There is building up as well as breaking down and changing. You have heard, perhaps, of a common surgical operation resorted to in cases where the nose has been destroyed. A flap of skin is cut from the forehead, turned down on the nose, and heals in the new position. This is a kind of grafting in a new position of part of an animal upon itself. Grafting of freshly obtained material from another animal is also possible. The case of teeth, for example. The grafting of skin and bone is done to facilitate healing. The surgeon places in the middle of the wound pieces of skin snipped from another animal, or fragments of bone from a victim freshly killed. Hunter's cockspur, possibly you have heard of that, flourished on the bull's neck, and the rhinoceros rats of the Algerian Zouaves are also to be thought of. Monsters manufactured by transferring a slip from the tail of an ordinary rat to its snout, and allowing it to heal in that position. "Monsters manufactured?" said I. "Then you mean to tell me—" "Yes. These creatures you have seen are animals, carven and wrought into new shapes. To that, to the study of the plasticity of living forms, my life has been devoted. I have studied for years, gaining in knowledge as I go. I see you look horrified, and yet I am telling you nothing new. It all lay in the surface of practical anatomy years ago, but no one had the temerity to touch it. It is not simply the outward form of an animal which I can change. The physiology, the chemical rhythm of the creature may also be made to undergo an enduring modification, of which vaccination and other methods of inoculation with living or dead matter are examples that will, no doubt, be familiar to you. A similar operation is the transfusion of blood, with which subject, indeed, I began. These are all familiar cases. Less so, and probably far more extensive, were the operations of those medieval practitioners who made dwarfs and beggar cripples, show monsters, some vestiges of whose art still remain in the preliminary manipulation of the young mountebank or contortionist. Victor Hugo gives an account of them in L'Homme qui rit. But perhaps my meaning grows plain now. You begin to see that it is a possible thing to transplant tissue from one part of an animal to another, or from one animal to another. To alter its chemical reactions and methods of growth, to modify the articulations of its limbs, and indeed to change it in its most intimate structure. And yet this extraordinary branch of knowledge has never been sought as an end and systematically by modern investigators until I took it up. Some such things have been hit upon in the last resort of surgery. Most of the kindred evidence that will recur to your mind has been demonstrated, as it were, by accident, by tyrants, by criminals, by the breeders of horses and dogs, by all kinds of untrained, clumsy-handed men working for their own immediate ends. I was the first man to take up this question armed with antiseptic surgery, and with a really scientific knowledge of the laws of growth. Yet one would imagine it must have been practiced in secret before. Such creatures as the Siamese twins, and in the vaults of the Inquisition. No doubt their chief aim was artistic torture, but some, at least, of the Inquisitors must have had a touch of scientific curiosity. "But," said I, "these things, these animals, talk." He said that was so, and proceeded to point out that the possibility of vivisection does not stop at a mere physical metamorphosis. A pig may be educated. The mental structure is even less determinate than the bodily. In our growing science of hypnotism we find the promise of a possibility of superseding old inherent instincts by new suggestions, grafting upon or replacing the inherited fixed ideas. Very much, indeed, of what we call moral education, he said, is such an artificial modification and perversion of instinct. Pugnacity is trained into courageous self-sacrifice, and suppressed sexuality into religious emotion. And the great difference between man and monkey is in the larynx, he continued, in the incapacity to frame delicately different sound symbols by which thought could be sustained. In this I failed to agree with him, but with a certain incivility he declined to notice my objection. He repeated that the thing was so, and continued his account of his work. I asked him why he had taken the human form as a model. There seemed to me then, and there still seems to me now, a strange wickedness for that choice. He confessed that he had chosen that form by chance. I might just as well have worked to form sheep into llamas, and llamas into sheep. I suppose there is something in the human form that appeals to the artistic turn of mind more powerfully than any animal shape can. But I've not confined myself to man-making. Once or twice he was silent, for a minute perhaps. These years, how they have slipped by! And here I have wasted a day saving your life, and am now wasting an hour explaining myself. "But," said I still do not understand. Where is your justification for inflicting all this pain? The only thing that could excuse vivisection to me would be some application—" "Precisely," said he. "But, you see, I am differently constituted. We are on different platforms. You are a materialist." "I am not a materialist," I began hotly. In my view. For it is just this question of pain that parts us. So long as visible or audible pain turns you sick, so long as your own pains drive you, so long as pain underlies your propositions about sin, so long, I tell you, you are an animal, thinking a little less obscurely what an animal feels. This pain—" I gave an impatient shrug at such sophistry. "Oh, but it is such a little thing. A mind truly open to what science has to teach must see that it is a little thing. It may be that, save in this little planet, this speck of cosmic dust, invisible long before the nearest star could be attained, it may be, I say, that nowhere else does this thing called pain occur. But the laws we feel our way towards, why, even on this earth, even among living things, what pain is there? As he spoke, he drew a little penknife from his pocket, opened the smaller blade, and moved his chair so that I could see his thigh. Then, choosing the place deliberately, he drove the blade into his leg and withdrew it. "No doubt," he said, "you have seen that before. It does not hurt a pinprick. But what does it show? The capacity for pain is not needed in the muscle, and it is not placed there, is but little needed in the skin, and only here and there over the thigh is a spot capable of feeling pain. Pain is simply our intrinsic medical adviser to warn us and stimulate us. Not all living flesh is painful, nor is all nerve, not even our sensory nerve. There's no taint of pain, real pain, in the sensations of the optic nerve. If you wound the optic nerve, you merely see flashes of light, just as disease of the auditory nerve merely means a humming in our ears. Plants do not feel pain, nor the lower animals. It's possible that such animals as the starfish and crayfish do not feel pain at all. Then, with men, the more intelligent they become, the more intelligently they will see after their own welfare, and the less they will need the goad to keep them out of danger. I never yet heard of a useless thing that was not ground out of existence by evolution sooner or later. Did you? And pain gets needless. Then I am a religious man, Prendick, as every sane man must be. It may be, I fancy, that I have seen more of the ways of this world's Maker than you, for I have sought his laws, in my way, all my life, while you, I understand, have been collecting butterflies. And, I tell you, pleasure and pain have nothing to do with heaven or hell. Pleasure and pain, bah! What is your theologian's ecstasy but Mohammed's Uri in the dark? This store which men and women set on pleasure and pain, Prendick, is the mark of the beast upon them, the mark of the beast from which they came. Pain and pleasure, they are for us only so long as we wriggle in the dust. You see, I went on with this research just the way it led me. That is the only way I ever heard of true research going. I asked a question, devised some method of obtaining an answer, and got a fresh question. Was this possible or that possible? You cannot imagine what this means to an investigator, what an intellectual passion grows upon him. You cannot imagine the strange, colourless delight of these intellectual desires. The thing before you is no longer an animal, a fellow creature, but a problem. Sympathetic pain, all I know of it, I remember as a thing I used to suffer from years ago. I wanted—it was the one thing I wanted—to find out the extreme limit of plasticity in a living shape. "But," said I, "the thing is an abomination." "To this day I have never troubled about the ethics of the matter," he continued. "The study of nature makes a man at last as remorseless as nature. I have gone on, not heeding anything but the question I was pursuing, and the material has dripped into the huts yonder. It is nearly 11 years since we came here, I and Montgomery and 6 Kanakas. I remember the green stillness of the island and the empty ocean about us as though it was yesterday. The place seemed waiting for me. The stores were landed and the house was built. The Kanakas founded some huts near the ravine. I went to work here upon what I had brought with me. There were some disagreeable things happened at first. I began with a sheep, and killed it after a day and a half by a slip of the scalpel. I took another sheep, I made a thing of pain and fear, and left it bound up to heal. It looked quite human to me when I had finished it, but when I went to it I was discontented with it. It remembered me, and was terrified beyond imagination, and it had no more than the wits of a sheep. The more I looked at it, the clumsier it seemed, until at last I put the monster out of its misery. These animals without courage, these fear-haunted, pain-driven things, without a spark of pugnacious energy to face torment, they are no good for man-making. Then I took a gorilla I had, and upon that, working with infinite care and mastering difficulty after difficulty, I made my first man. All the week, night and day, I moulded him. With him it was chiefly the brain that needed moulding. Much had to be added, much changed. I thought him a fair specimen of the negroid type when I had finished him, and he lay bandaged, bound, and motionless before me. It was only when his life was assured that I left him and came into this room again, and found Montgomery much as you are. He had heard some of the cries as the thing grew human, cries like those that disturbed you so. I didn't take him into my confidence at first, and the Kanakas, too, had realized something of it. They were scared out of their wits by the sight of me. I got Montgomery over to me, in a way, but I and he had the hardest job to prevent the Kanakas deserting. Finally they did, and so we lost the yacht. I spent many days educating the brute. Altogether I had him for 3 or 4 months. I taught him the rudiments of English, gave him ideas of counting, even made the thing read the alphabet. But at that he was slow, though I've met with idiots slower. He began with a clean sheet mentally, had no memories left in his mind of what he had been. When his scars were quite healed, and he was no longer anything but painful and stiff, and able to converse a little, I took him yonder and introduced him to the Kanakas as an interesting stowaway. They were horribly afraid of him at first, somehow, which offended me rather, for I was conceited about him. But his ways seemed so mild, and he was so abject, that after a time they received him and took his education in hand. He was quick to learn, very imitative and adaptive, and built himself a hovel rather better, it seemed to me, than their own shanties. There was one among the boys a bit of a missionary, and he taught the thing to read, or at least to pick out letters, and gave him some rudimentary ideas of morality. But it seems the beast's habits were not all that is desirable. I rested from work for some days after this, and was in a mind to write an account of the whole affair, to wake up English physiology. Then I came upon the creature squatting up in a tree, and gibbering at 2 of the Kanakas who had been teasing him. I threatened him, told him the inhumanity of such a proceeding, aroused his sense of shame, and came home resolved to do better before I took my work back to England. I have been doing better, but somehow the things drift back again. The stubborn beast-flesh grows day by day back again. But I mean to do better things still. I mean to conquer that. This puma— But that's the story. All the Kanaka boys are dead now. One fell overboard of the launch, and one died of a wounded heel that he poisoned in some way with plant juice. 3 went away in the yacht, and I suppose, and hope, were drowned. The other one was killed. Well, I have replaced them. Montgomery went on much as you are disposed to do at first, and then— "What became of the other one?" said I, sharply. "The other Kanaka who was killed?" "The fact is, after I had made a number of human creatures, I made a thing." He hesitated. "Yes," said I. "It was killed." "I don't understand," said I. "Do you mean to say—" "It killed the Kanakais. It killed several other things that it caught. We chased it for a couple of days. It only got loose by accident, never meant it to get away. It wasn't finished. It was purely an experiment. It was a limbless thing with a horrible face that writhed along the ground in a serpentine fashion. It was immensely strong, and in infuriating pain. It lurked in the woods for some days until we hunted it, and then it wriggled into the northern part of the island, and we divided the party to close in upon it. Montgomery insisted upon coming with me. The man had a rifle, and when his body was found, one of the barrels was curved into the shape of an S and very nearly bitten through. Montgomery shot the thing. After that I stuck to the ideal of humanity, except for little things. He became silent. I sat in silence, watching his face. So, for 20 years altogether, counting 9 years in England, I have been going on. And there is still something in everything I do that defeats me, makes me dissatisfied, challenges me to further effort. Sometimes I rise above my level, sometimes I fall below it, but always I fall short of the things I dream. The human shape I can get now, almost with ease, so that it is lithe and graceful, or thick and strong. But often there is trouble with the hands and the claws, painful things that I dare not shape too freely. But it is in the subtle grafting and reshaping one must needs do to the brain that my trouble lies. The intelligence is often oddly low, with unaccountable blank ends, unexpected gaps. And least satisfactory of all is something that I cannot touch somewhere. I cannot determine wherein the seat of the emotions. Cravings, instincts, desires that harm humanity, a strange hidden reservoir to burst forth suddenly and inundate the whole being of the creature with anger, hate, or fear. These creatures of mine seemed strange and uncanny to you so soon as you began to observe them. But to me, just after I make them, they seem to be indisputably human beings. It's afterwards, as I observe them, that the persuasion fades. First one animal trait, then another, creeps to the surface and stares out at me. But I will conquer yet. Each time I dip a living creature into the bath of burning pain, I say, this time I will burn out all the animal. This time I will make a rational creature of my own. After all, what is 10 years? Men have been 100,000 in the making, he thought darkly. But I am drawing near the fastness. This puma of mine— After a silence, and they revert. As soon as my hand is taken from them, the beast begins to creep back, begins to assert itself again. Another long silence. "Then you take the things you make into those dens?" said I. "They go. I turn them out when I begin to feel the beast in them. Presently they wander there. They all dread this house and me. There is a kind of travesty of humanity over there. Montgomery knows about it, for he interferes in their affairs. He has trained 1 or 2 of them to our service. He's ashamed of it, but I believe he half likes some of those beasts. It's his business, not mine. They only sicken me with a sense of failure. I take no interest in them. I fancy they follow in the lines the Kanaka missionary marked out, and have a kind of mockery of a rational life, poor beasts. There's something they call the law, sing hymns about all thine. They build themselves their dens, gather fruits, and pull herbs, marry even. But I can see through it all, see into their very souls, and see there nothing but the souls of beasts, beasts that perish, anger and the lusts to live and gratify themselves. Yet they're odd, complex, like everything else alive. There is a kind of upward striving in them, part vanity, part waste sexual emotion, part waste curiosity. It only mocks me. I have some hope of this puma. I have worked hard at her head and brain. And now, said he, standing up after a long gap of silence, during which we had each pursued our own thoughts. "What do you think? Are you in fear of me still?" I looked at him, and saw but a white-faced, white-haired man with calm eyes. Save for his serenity, the touch almost of beauty that resulted from his set tranquillity and his magnificent build, he might have passed muster among 100 other comfortable old gentlemen. Then I shivered. By way of answer to his second question, I handed him a revolver with either hand. "Keep them," he said, and snatched at a yawn. He stood up, stared at me for a moment, and smiled. "You have had 2 eventful days," said he. "I should advise some sleep. I'm glad it's all clear. Good night." He thought me over for a moment, then went out by the inner door. I immediately turned the key in the outer one. I sat down again, sat for a time in a kind of stagnant mood, so weary emotionally, mentally, and physically, that I could not think beyond the point at which he had left me. The black window stared at me like an eye. At last, with an effort, I put out the light and got into the hammock. Very soon I was asleep. End of Part 5. Part 6 of The Island of Doctor Moreau. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. Concerning the Beast Folk. I woke early. Moreau's explanation stood before my mind, clear and definite, from the moment of my awakening. I got out of the hammock and went to the door to assure myself that the key was turned. Then I tried the window bar and found it firmly fixed. That these man-like creatures were in truth only bestial monsters, mere grotesque travesties of men, filled me with a vague uncertainty of their possibilities which was far worse than any definite fear. A tapping came at the door, and I heard the glutinous accents of M'ling speaking. I pocketed one of the revolvers, keeping one hand upon it, and opened to him. "Good morning, sir," he said, bringing in addition to the customary herb breakfast, an ill-cooked rabbit. Montgomery followed him. His roving eye caught the position of my arm, and he smiled askew. The puma was resting to heal that day, but Moreau, who was singularly solitary in his habits, did not join us. I talked with Montgomery to clear my ideas of the way in which the beast folk lived. In particular, I was urgent to know how these inhuman monsters were kept from falling upon Moreau and Montgomery, and from rending one another. He explained to me that the comparative safety of Moreau and himself was due to the limited mental scope of these monsters. In spite of their increased intelligence and the tendency of their animal instincts to reawaken, they had certain fixed ideas implanted by Moreau in their minds, which absolutely bounded their imaginations. They were really hypnotized, had been told that certain things were impossible, and that certain things were not to be done, and these prohibitions were woven into the texture of their minds beyond any possibility of disobedience or dispute. Certain matters, however, in which old instinct was at war with Moreau's convenience, were in a less stable condition. A series of propositions, called the law, I had already heard them recited, battled in their minds with the deep-seated, ever-rebellious cravings of their animal natures. This law they were ever repeating, I found, and ever breaking. Both Montgomery and Moreau displayed particular solicitude to keep them ignorant of the taste of blood. They feared the inevitable suggestions of that flavour. Montgomery told me that the law, especially among the feline beast people, became oddly weakened about nightfall, that then the animal was at its strongest, that a spirit of adventure sprang up in them at the dusk, when they would dare things they never seemed to dream about by day. To that I owed my stalking by the Leopard Man, on the night of my arrival. But during these earlier days of my stay they broke the law only furtively and after dark. In the daylight There was a general atmosphere of respect for its multifarious prohibitions. And here, perhaps, I may give a few general facts about the island and the Beast People. The island, which is of irregular outline and lay low upon the wide sea, had a total area, I suppose, of 7 or 8 square miles. It was volcanic in origin, and was now fringed on 3 sides by coral reefs. Some fumaroles to the northward and a hot spring were the only vestiges of the forces that had long since originated it. Now and then a faint quiver of earthquake would be sensible, and sometimes the ascent of the spire of smoke would be rendered tumultuous by gusts of steam, but that was all. The population of the island, Montgomery informed me, now numbered rather more than 60 of these strange creations of Moreau's art, not counting the smaller monstrosities which lived in the undergrowth and were without human form. Altogether he had made nearly 120, but many had died, and others, like the writhing footless thing of which he had told me, had come by violent ends. In answer to my question, Montgomery said that they actually bore offspring, but that these generally died. When they lived, Moreau took them and stamped the human form upon them. There was no evidence of the inheritance of their acquired human characteristics. The females were less numerous than the males, and liable to much furtive persecution, in spite of the monogamy the law enjoined. It would be impossible for me to describe these Beast People in detail. My eye has had no training in details, and unhappily I cannot sketch. Most striking, perhaps, in their general appearance, was the disproportion between the legs of these creatures and the length of their bodies, and yet, so relative is our idea of grace, my eye became habituated to their forms, and at last I even fell in with their persuasion that my own long thighs were ungainly. Another point was the forward carriage of the head and the clumsy and inhuman curvature of the spine. Even the ape-man lacked that inward sinuous curve of the back which makes the human figure so graceful. Most had their shoulders hunched clumsily, and their short forearms hung weakly at their sides. Few of them were conspicuously hairy, at least until the end of my time upon the island. The next most obvious deformity was in their faces, almost all of which were prognathous, malformed about the ears, with large and protuberant noses, very furry or very bristly hair, and often strangely coloured or strangely placed eyes. None could laugh, though the ape-man had a chattering titter. Beyond these general characters, their heads had little in common. Each preserved the quality of its particular species. The human mark distorted but did not hide the leopard, the ox, or the sow, or other animal or animals from which the creature had been moulded. The voices, too, varied exceedingly. The hands were almost malformed, and though some surprised me by their unexpected human appearance, almost all were deficient in the number of the digits, clumsy about the finger-nails, and lacking any tactile sensibility. The 2 most formidable animal men were my leopard-man and a creature made of hyena and swine. Larger than these were the 3 bull-creatures who pulled in the boat. Then came the silvery hairy man, who was also sayer of the law, Emling, and a satyr-like creature of ape and goat. There were 3 swine-men and a swine-woman, a mare rhinoceros creature, and several other females, whose sources I did not ascertain. There were several wolf creatures, a bear bull, and a St. Bernard man. I have already described the ape-man, and there was a particularly hateful and evil-smelling old woman made of vixen and bear, whom I hated from the beginning. She was said to be a passionate votary of the law. Smaller creatures were certain dappled youths and my little sloth creature. But enough of this catalogue. At first I had a shivering horror of the brutes, felt all too keenly that they were still brutes, but insensibly I became a little habituated to the idea of them, and moreover I was affected by Montgomery's attitude towards them. He had been with them so long that he had come to regard them as almost normal human beings. His London days seemed a glorious, impossible past to him. Only once in a year or so did he go to Africa to deal with Moreau's agent, a trader in animals there. He hardly met the finest type of manhood in that seafaring village of Spanish mongrels. The men aboard ship, he told me, seemed at first just as strange to him as the beast men seemed to me, unnaturally long in the leg, flat in the face, prominent in the forehead, suspicious, dangerous, and cold-hearted. In fact, he did not like men. His heart had warmed to me, he thought, because he had saved my life. I fancied even then that he had a sneaking kindness for some of these metamorphosed brutes, a vicious sympathy with some of their ways, but that he attempted to veil it from me at first. Emling, the black-faced man, Montgomery's attendant, the first of the beast folk I had encountered, did not live with the others across the island, but in a small kennel at the back of the enclosure. The creature was scarcely so intelligent as the ape-man, but far more docile, and the most human-looking of all the beast folk, and Montgomery had trained it to prepare food and, indeed, to discharge all the trivial domestic offices that were required. It was a complex trophy of Moreau's horrible skill, a bear, tainted with dog and ox, and one of the most elaborately made of all his creatures. It treated Montgomery with a strange tenderness and devotion. Sometimes he would notice it, pat it, call it half-mocking, half-jocular names, and so make it caper with extraordinary delight. Sometimes he would ill-treat it, especially after he had been at the whiskey, kicking it, beating it, pelting it with stones or lighted fusees. But whether he treated it well or ill, it loved nothing so much as to be near him. I say I became habituated to the beast people, that 1,000 things which had seemed unnatural and repulsive speedily became natural and ordinary to me. I suppose everything in existence takes its colour from the average hue of our surroundings. Montgomery and Moreau were too peculiar and individual to keep my general impressions of humanity well defined. I would see one of the clumsy bovine creatures who worked the launch treading heavily through the undergrowth, and find myself asking, trying hard to recall, how he differed from some really human yokel trudging home from his mechanical labours. Or I would meet the fox-bear woman's vulpine, shifty face, strangely human in its speculative cunning, and even imagine I had met it before in some city byway. Yet every now and then the beast would flash out upon me beyond doubt or denial. An ugly-looking man, a hunchbacked human savage to all appearance, squatting in the aperture of one of the dens, would stretch his arms and yawn, showing with startling suddenness scissor-edged incisors and sabre-like canines, keen and brilliant as knives. Or, in some narrow pathway, glancing with a transitory daring into the eyes of some lithe, white-swathed female figure, I would suddenly see, with a spasmodic revulsion, that she had slit-like pupils, or glancing down, note the curving nail with which she held her shapeless wrap about her. It is a curious thing, by the by, for which I am quite unable to account, that these weird creatures, the females, I mean, had in the earlier days of my stay an instinctive sense of their own repulsive clumsiness, and displayed, in consequence, a more than human regard for the decency and decorum of extensive costume. Chapter 16. How the Beast Folk Taste Blood. My inexperience as a writer betrays me, and I wander from the thread of my story. After I had breakfasted with Montgomery, he took me across the island to see the fumarole and the source of the hot spring into whose scalding waters I had blundered on the previous day. Both of us carried whips and loaded revolvers. While going through a leafy jungle on our road thither, we heard a rabbit squealing. We stopped and listened, but we heard no more, and presently we went on our way, and the incident dropped out of our minds. Montgomery called my attention to certain little pink animals with long hind legs that went leaping through the undergrowth. He told me they were creatures made of the offspring of the beast people that Moreau had invented. He had fancied they might serve for meat, but a rabbit-like habit of devouring their young had defeated this intention. I had already encountered some of these creatures, once during my moonlight flight from the Leopard Man, and once during my pursuit by Moreau on the previous day. By chance, one hopping to avoid us leapt into the hole caused by the uprooting of a wind-blown tree. Before it could extricate itself, We managed to catch it. It spat like a cat, scratched and kicked vigorously with its hind legs, and made an attempt to bite. But its teeth were too feeble to inflict more than a painless pinch. It seemed to me rather a pretty little creature, and as Montgomery stated that it never destroyed the turf by burrowing, and was very cleanly in its habits, I should imagine it might prove a convenient substitute for the common rabbit in gentlemen's parks. We also saw on our way the trunk of a tree barked in long strips and splintered deeply. Montgomery called my attention to this. "Not to claw bark of trees, that is the law," he said. "Much some of them care for it." It was after this, I think, that we met the satyr and the ape-man. The satyr was a gleam of classical memory on the part of Moreau, his face ovine in expression, like a coarser Hebrew type, his voice a harsh bleat, his nether extremities satanic. He was gnawing on the husk of a pod-like fruit as he passed us. Both of them saluted Montgomery. "Hail," said they, "to the other with the whip." "There's a third with a whip now," said Montgomery, "so you'd better mind." "Was he not made?" said the ape-man. He said he was made. The satyr-man looked curiously at me. "A third with the whip, he that walks weeping into the sea, has a thin white face." "He has a thin long whip," said Montgomery. "Yesterday he bled and wept," said the satyr. "You never bleed nor weep. The master does not bleed or weep." "Ollendorfian beggar," said Montgomery. "You bleed and weep if you don't look out." "He has 5 fingers. He is a 5-man like me," said the ape-man. "Come along, Prendick," said Montgomery, taking my arm, and I went on with him. The satyr and the ape-man stood watching us and making other remarks to each other. "He says nothing," said the satyr. "Men have voices." "Yesterday he asked me of things to eat," said the ape-man. "He did not know." Then they spoke inaudible things, and I heard the satyr laughing. It was on our way back that we came upon the dead rabbit. The red body of the wretched little beast was rent to pieces, many of the ribs stripped white, and the backbone indisputably gnawed. At that Montgomery stopped. "Good God!" said he, stooping down and picking up some of the crushed vertebrae to examine them more closely. "Good God!" he repeated. "What can this mean?" "Some carnivore of yours has remembered its old habits," I said after a pause. "This backbone has been bitten through." He stood staring, with his face white and his lip pulled askew. "I don't like this," he said slowly. "I saw something of the same kind," said I, "the first day I came here." "The devil you did! What was it?" "A rabbit with its head twisted off." "The day you came here?" "The day I came here, in the undergrowth at the back of the enclosure, when I went out in the evening. The head was completely wrung off." He gave a long, low whistle. "And what is more, I have an idea which of your brutes did the thing. It's only a suspicion, you know. Before I came on the rabbit, I saw one of your monsters drinking in the stream." "Sucking his drink?" "Yes." "Not to suck your drink. That is the law. Much the brutes care for the law, when Moreau's not about. It was the brute who chased me." "Of course," said Montgomery. "It's just the way with carnivores. After a kill they drink. It's the taste of blood, you know. What was the brute like?" he continued. "Would you know him again?" He glanced about us, standing astride over the mess of dead rabbit, his eyes roving among the shadows and scenes of greenery, the lurking places and ambuscades of the forest that bounded us in. "The taste of blood," he said again. He took out his revolver, examined the cartridges in it, and replaced it. Then he began to pull at his dropping lip. "I think I should know the brute again," I said. "I stunned him. He ought to have a handsome bruise on the forehead of him." "But then we have to prove that he killed the rabbit," said Montgomery. "I wish I'd never brought the things here." I should have gone on, but he stayed there thinking over the mangled rabbit in a puzzle-headed way. As it was, I went to such a distance that the rabbit's remains were hidden. "Come on," I said. Presently he woke up and came towards me. "You see," he said, almost in a whisper, "they are all supposed to have a fixed idea against eating anything that runs on land. If some brute has by any accident tasted blood—" We went on some way in silence. "I wonder what can have happened," he said to himself. Then, after a pause again, "I did a foolish thing the other day. That servant of mine showed him how to skin and cook a rabbit. It's odd. Saw him licking his hands. It never occurred to me. Then, we must put a stop to this. I must tell Moreau." He could think of nothing else on our homeward journey. Moreau took the matter even more seriously than Montgomery, and I need scarcely say that I was affected by their evident consternation. "We must make an example," said Moreau. "I've no doubts in my own mind that the leopard man was the sinner. But how can we prove it? I wish, Montgomery, you had kept your taste for meat in hand, and gone without these exciting novelties. We may find ourselves in a mess yet through it." "I was a silly ass," said Montgomery. "But the thing's done now, and you said I might have them, you know." "We must see to the thing at once," said Moreau. "I suppose if anything should turn up, M'ling can take care of himself." "I'm not so sure of M'ling," said Montgomery. "I think I ought to know him." In the afternoon, Moreau, Montgomery, myself, and M'ling went across the island to the huts in the ravine. We three were armed. M'ling carried the little hatchet he used in chopping firewood, and some coils of wire. Moreau had a large cowherd's horn slung over his shoulder. "You will see a gathering of the Beast People," said Montgomery. "It's a pretty sight." Moreau said not a word on the way, but the expression of his heavy, white-fringed face was grimly set. We crossed the ravine down which smoked the stream of hot water, and followed the winding pathway through the cane-brakes until we reached a wide area covered over with a thick powdery yellow substance which I believe was sulphur. Above the shoulder of a weedy bank the sea glittered. We came to a kind of shallow natural amphitheatre, and here the four of us halted. Then Moreau sounded the horn, and broke the sleeping stillness of the tropical afternoon. He must have had strong lungs. The hooting note rose and rose amidst its echoes, to at last an ear-penetrating intensity. "Ah," said Moreau, letting the curved instrument fall to his side again. Immediately there was a crashing through the yellow canes, and a sound of voices from the dense green jungle that marked the morass through which I had run on the previous day. Then, at 3 or 4 points on the edge of the sulphurous area, appeared the grotesque forms of the Beast People hurrying towards us. I could not help a creeping horror as I perceived first one and then another trot out from the trees or reeds and come shambling along over the hot dust. But Moreau and Montgomery stood calmly enough, and perforce I stuck beside them. First to arrive was the satyr, strangely unreal for all that he cast a shadow and tossed the dust with his hoofs. After him, from the brake, came a monstrous lout, a thing of horse and rhinoceros, chewing a straw as it came. Then appeared the swine-woman and 2 wolf-women, then the fox-bear witch with her red eyes and her peaked red face, and then others, all hurrying eagerly. As they came forward, they began to cringe towards Moreau, and chant, quite regardless of one another, fragments of the latter half of the litany of the law. His is the hand that wounds, his is the hand that heals, and so forth. As soon as they had approached within a distance of perhaps 30 yards, they halted, and bowing on knees and elbows, began flinging the white dust upon their heads. Imagine the scene, if you can. We 3 blue-clad men, with our misshapen black-faced attendant, standing in a wide expanse of sunlit yellow dust under the blazing blue sky, and surrounded by this circle of crouching and gesticulating monstrosities, some almost human save in their subtle expression and gestures, some like cripples, some so strangely distorted as to resemble nothing but the denizens of our wildest dreams, and beyond, the reedy lines of a canebrake in one direction, a dense tangle of palm trees on the other, separating us from the ravine with the huts, and to the north the hazy horizon of the Pacific Ocean. 62, 63, counted Moreau. There are 4 more. I do not see the leopard man, said I. Presently Moreau sounded the great horn again, and at the sound of it all the beast people writhed and grovelled in the dust. Then, slinking out of the canebrake, stooping near the ground and trying to join the dust-throwing circle behind Moreau's back, came the leopard man. The last of the beast people to arrive was the little ape-man. The earlier animals, hot and weary with their grovelling, shot vicious glances at him. "Cease!" said Moreau in his firm, loud voice, and the beast people sat back upon their hams and rested from their worshipping. "Where is the sayer of the law?" said Moreau, and the hairy grey monster bowed his face in the dust. "Say the words," said Moreau. Forthwith all in the kneeling assembly, swaying from side to side and dashing up the sulphur with their hands, first the right hand in a puff of dust, and then the left, began once more to chant their strange litany. When they reached not to eat flesh or fish, that is the law, Moreau held up his lank white hand. "Stop!" he cried, and there fell absolute silence upon them all. I think they all knew and dreaded what was coming. I looked round at their strange faces. When I saw their wincing attitudes and the furtive dread in their bright eyes, I wondered that I had ever believed them to be men. "That law has been broken," said Moreau. "None escape," from the faceless creature with the silvery hair. "None escape," repeated the kneeling circle of beast people. "Who is he?" cried Moreau, and looked round at their faces, cracking his whip. I fancied the hyena swine looked dejected. So too did the leopard man. Moreau stopped, facing this creature, who cringed towards him with the memory and dread of infinite torment. "Who is he?" repeated Moreau in a voice of thunder. "Evil is he who breaks the law," chanted the sayer of the law. Moreau looked into the eyes of the leopard man, and seemed to be dragging the very soul out of the creature. "Who breaks the law?" said Moreau, taking his eyes off his victim and turning towards us. It seemed to me there was a touch of exultation in his voice. "Goes back to the house of pain." They all clamoured, "Goes back to the house of pain, O master!" "Back to the house of pain," gabbled the ape-man, as though the idea was sweet to him. "Do you hear?" said Moreau, turning back to the criminal. "My friend? Hello?" For the leopard man, released from Moreau's eye, had risen straight from his knees, and now, with eyes aflame and his huge feline tusks flashing out from under his curling lips, leaped towards his tormentor. I am convinced that only the madness of unendurable fear could have prompted this attack. The whole circle of 80 monsters seemed to rise about us. I drew my revolver. The two figures collided. I saw Moreau reeling back from the leopard man's blow. There was a furious yelling and howling all about us. Every one was moving rapidly. For a moment I thought it was a general revolt. The furious face of the leopard man flashed by mine, with M'ling close in pursuit. I saw the yellow eyes of the hyena swine blazing with excitement, his attitude as if he were half resolved to attack me. The satyr, too, glared at me over the hyena swine's hunched shoulders. I heard the crack of Moreau's pistol, and saw the pink flash dart across the tumult. The whole crowd seemed to swing round in the direction of the glint of fire, and I too was swung round by the magnetism of the movement. In another second I was running, one of a tumultuous shouting crowd, in pursuit of the escaping leopard man. That is all I can tell definitely. I saw the leopard man strike Moreau, and then, Everything spun about me until I was running headlong. M'ling was ahead, close in pursuit of the fugitive. Behind, their tongues already lolling out, ran the wolf-women in great leaping strides. The swine-folk followed, squealing with excitement, and the two bull-men in their swathings of white. Then came Moreau in a cluster of the Beast People, his wide-brimmed straw hat blown off, his revolver in hand, and his lank white hair streaming out. The hyena swine ran beside me, keeping pace with me, and glancing furtively at me out of his feline eyes, and the others came pattering and shouting behind us. The leopard man went bursting his way through the long canes, which sprang back as he passed and rattled in M'ling's face. We others in the rear found a trampled path for us when we reached the break. The chase lay through the break for perhaps a quarter of a mile, and then plunged into a dense thicket which retarded our movements exceedingly, though we went through it in a crowd together, fronds flicking into our faces, ropey creepers catching us under the chin or gripping our ankles, thorny plants hooking into and tearing cloth and flesh together. "He has gone on all fours through this," panted Moreau, now just ahead of me. "None escape," said the wolf-bear, laughing into my face with the exultation of hunting. We burst out again among rocks, and saw the quarry ahead running lightly on all fours, and snarling at us over his shoulder. At that the wolf-folk howled with delight. The thing was still clothed, and at a distance its face still seemed human, but the carriage of its four limbs was feline, and the furtive droop of its shoulder was distinctly that of a hunted animal. It leapt over some thorny yellow-flowering bushes and was hidden. M'ling was halfway across the space. Most of us now had lost the first speed of the chase, and had fallen into a longer and steadier stride. I saw, as we traversed the open, that the pursuit was now spreading from a column into a line. The hyena swine still ran close to me, watching me as it ran, every now and then puckering its muzzle with a snarling laugh. At the edge of the rocks, the leopard man, realizing that he was making for the projecting cape upon which he had stalked me on the night of my arrival, had doubled in the undergrowth. But Montgomery had seen the maneuver, and turned him again. So, panting, tumbling against rocks, torn by brambles, impeded by ferns and reeds, I helped to pursue the leopard man who had broken the law, and the hyena swine ran, laughing savagely, by my side. I staggered on, my head reeling and my heart beating against my ribs, tired almost to death, and yet not daring to lose sight of the chase lest I should be left alone with this horrible companion. I staggered on in spite of the infinite fatigue and the dense heat of the tropical afternoon. At last the fury of the hunt slackened. We had pinned the wretched brute into a corner of the island. Moreau, whip in hand, marshalled us all into an irregular line, and we advanced now slowly, shouting to one another as we advanced, and tightening the cordon about our victim. He lurked noiseless and invisible in the bushes through which I had run from him during that midnight pursuit. "Steady!" cried Moreau. "Steady!" as the ends of the line crept round the tangle of undergrowth and hemmed the brute in. "Beware of rush!" came the voice of Montgomery from behind the thicket. I was on the slope above the bushes. Montgomery and Moreau beat along the beach beneath. Slowly we passed in among the fretted network of branches and leaves. The quarry was silent. "Back to the House of Pain! The House of Pain! The House of Pain!" yelped the voice of the ape-man, some 20 yards to the right. When I heard that, I forgave the poor wretch all the fear he had inspired in me. I heard the twigs snap and the boughs swish aside before the heavy tread of the horse rhinoceros upon my right. Then, suddenly, through a polygon of green, in the half-darkness under the luxuriant growth, I saw the creature we were hunting. I halted. He was crouched together into the smallest possible compass, his luminous green eyes turned over his shoulder regarding me. It may seem a strange contradiction in me, I cannot explain the fact, but now, seeing the creature there in a perfectly animal attitude, with the light gleaming in its eyes and its imperfectly human face distorted with terror, I realized again the fact of its humanity. In another moment other of its pursuers would see it, and it would be overpowered and captured, to experience once more the horrible tortures of the enclosure. Abruptly I slipped out my revolver, aimed toward its terror-struck eyes, and fired. As I did so, the hyena swine saw the thing and flung itself upon it with an eager cry, thrusting thirsty teeth into its neck. All about me the green masses of the thicket were swaying and cracking as the beast people came rushing together. One face and then another appeared. "Don't kill it, Prendick!" called Moreau. "Don't kill it!" And I saw him stooping as he pushed through under the fronds of the big ferns. In another moment he had beaten off the hyena swine with the handle of his whip, and he and Montgomery were keeping away the excited carnivorous beast people, and particularly Emling, from the still quivering body. The hair-grey thing came sniffing at the corpse under my arm. The other animals, in their animal ardour, jostled me to get a nearer view. "Confound you, Prendick!" said Moreau. "I wanted him." "I'm sorry," said I, though I was not. It was the impulse of the moment. I felt sick with exertion and excitement. Turning, I pushed my way out of the crowding beast people and went on alone up the slope towards the higher part of the headland. Under the shouted directions of Moreau, I heard the 3 white-swathed bullmen begin dragging the victim down towards the water. It was easy now for me to be alone. The beast people manifested a quite human curiosity about the dead body, and followed it in a thick knot, sniffing and growling at it as the bullmen dragged it down the beach. I went to the headland and watched the bullmen, black against the evening sky as they carried the weighted dead body out to sea, and like a wave across my mind came the realization of the unspeakable aimlessness of things upon the island. Upon the beach among the rocks beneath me were the ape-man, the hyena swine, and several other of the beast people, standing about Montgomery and Moreau. They were all still intensely excited, and all overflowing with noisy expressions of their loyalty to the law. Yet I felt an absolute assurance in my own mind that the hyena swine was implicated in the rabbit-killing. A strange persuasion came upon me that, save for the grossness of the line, the grotesqueness of the forms, I had here before me the whole balance of human life in miniature, the whole interplay of instinct, reason, and fate in its simplest form. The leopard man had happened to go under. That was all the difference. Poor brute. Poor brutes! I began to see the viler aspect of Moreau's cruelty. I had not thought before of the pain and trouble that came to these poor victims after they had passed from Moreau's hands. I had shivered only at the days of actual torment in the enclosure, but now that seemed to me the lesser part. Before they had been beasts, their instincts fitly adapted to their surroundings, and happy as living things may be. Now they stumbled in the shackles of humanity, lived in a fear that never died, fretted by a law they could not understand. Their mock-human existence, begun in an agony, was one long internal struggle, one long dread of Moreau. And for what? It was the wantonness of it that stirred me. Had Moreau had any intelligible object, I could have sympathized at least a little with him. I am not so squeamish about pain as that. I could have forgiven him a little, even, had his motive been only hate. But he was so irresponsible, so utterly careless. His curiosity, his mad, aimless investigations drove him on, and the things were thrown out to live a year or so, to struggle and blunder and suffer, and at last to die painfully. They were wretched in themselves. The old animal hate moved them to trouble one another. The law held them back from a brief, hot struggle and a decisive end to their natural animosities. In those days my fear of the beast people went the way of my personal fear for Moreau. I fell indeed into a morbid state, deep and enduring, and alien to fear, which has left permanent scars upon my mind. I must confess that I lost faith in the sanity of the world when I saw it suffering the painful disorder of this island. A blind fate, a vast pitiless mechanism, seemed to cut and shape the fabric of existence, and I, Moreau, by his passion for research, Montgomery, by his passion for drink, the Beast People, with their instincts and mental restrictions, were torn and crushed, ruthlessly, inevitably, amid the infinite complexity of its incessant wheels. But this condition did not come all at once. I think, indeed, that I anticipate a little in speaking of it now. End of Part 6. Part 7 of The Island of Doctor Moreau. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. A Catastrophe. Scarcely 6 weeks passed before I had lost every feeling but dislike and abhorrence for this infamous experiment of Moreau's. My one idea was to get away from these horrible caricatures of my Maker's image, back to the sweet and wholesome intercourse of men. My fellow creatures, from whom I was thus separated, began to assume idyllic virtue and beauty in my memory. My first friendship with Montgomery did not increase. His long separation from humanity, his secret vice of drunkenness, his evident sympathy with the Beast People tainted him to me. Several times I let him go alone among them. I avoided intercourse with them in every possible way. I spent an increasing proportion of my time upon the beach, looking for some liberating sail that never appeared, until one day there fell upon us an appalling disaster, which put an altogether different aspect upon my strange surroundings. It was about 7 or 8 weeks after my landing, rather more, I think, though I had not troubled to keep account of the time, when this catastrophe occurred. It happened in the early morning, I should think about 6. I had risen and breakfasted early, having been aroused by the noise of 3 beast-men carrying wood into the enclosure. After breakfast I went to the open gateway of the enclosure and stood there smoking a cigarette and enjoying the freshness of the early morning. Moreau presently came round the corner of the enclosure and greeted me. He passed by me, and I heard him, behind me, unlock and enter his laboratory. So indurated was I at that time to the abomination of the place, that I heard, without a touch of emotion, the puma victim begin another day of torture. It met its persecutor with a shriek, almost exactly like that of an angry virago. Then, suddenly, something happened. I do not know what to this day. I heard a short, sharp cry behind me, a fall, and turning, saw an awful face rushing upon me, not human, not animal, but hellish, brown, seamed with red branching scars, red drops starting out upon it, and lidless eyes ablaze. I threw up my arm to defend myself from the blow that flung me headlong with a broken forearm, and the great monster, swathed in lint and with red-stained bandages fluttering about it, leaped over me and passed. I rolled over and over down the beach, tried to sit up, and collapsed upon my broken arm. Then Moreau appeared, his massive white face all the more terrible for the blood that trickled from his forehead. He carried a revolver in one hand. He scarcely glanced at me, but rushed off at once, in pursuit of the puma. I tried the other arm, and sat up. The muffled figure in front ran in great striding leaps along the beach, and Moreau followed her. She turned her head and saw him, then, doubling abruptly, made for the bushes. She gained upon him at every stride. I saw her plunge into them, and Moreau, running slantingly to intercept her, fired and missed as she disappeared. Then he too vanished in the green confusion. I stared after them, and then the pain in my arm flamed up, and with a groan I staggered to my feet. Montgomery appeared in the doorway, dressed, and with his revolver in his hand. "Great God, Prendick!" he said. not noticing that I was hurt. "That brute's loose! Tore the fetter out of the wall! Have you seen them?" Then sharply, seeing I gripped my arm, "What's the matter?" "I was standing in the doorway," said I. He came forward and took my arm. "Blood on the sleeve," said he, and rolled back the flannel. He pocketed his weapon, felt my arm about painfully, and led me inside. "Your arm is broken," he said, and then, "Tell me exactly how it happened. What happened?" I told him what I had seen, told him in broken sentences, with gasps of pain between them, and very dexterously and swiftly he bound my arm meanwhile. He slung it from my shoulder, stood back, and looked at me. "You'll do," he said. "And now—" He thought. Then he went out and locked the gates of the enclosure. He was absent some time. I was chiefly concerned about my arm. The incident seemed merely one more of many horrible things. I sat down in the deck-chair, and I must admit swore heartily at the island. The first dull feeling of injury in my arm had already given way to a burning pain when Montgomery reappeared. His face was rather pale, and he showed more of his lower gums than ever. "I can neither see nor hear anything of them," he said. "I've been thinking he may want my help." He stared at me with his expressionless eyes. "That was a strong brute," he said. "It simply wrenched its fetter out of the wall." He went to the window, then to the door, and there turned to me. "I shall go after them," he said. "There's another revolver I can leave with you. To tell you the truth, I feel anxious somehow." He obtained the weapon and put it ready to my hand on the table, then went out, leaving a restless contagion in the air. I did not sit long after he left, but took the revolver in hand and went to the doorway. The morning was as still as death. Not a whisper of wind was stirring. The sea was like polished glass, the sky empty, the beach desolate. In my half-excited, half-feverish state, this stillness of things oppressed me. I tried to whistle, and the tune died away. I swore again, the second time that morning. Then I went to the corner of the enclosure and stared inland at the green bush that had swallowed up Moreau and Montgomery. When would they return, and how? Then, far away up the beach, a little grey beast-man appeared, ran down to the water's edge, and began splashing about. I strolled back to the doorway, then to the corner again, and so began pacing to and fro like a sentinel upon duty. Once I was arrested by the distant voice of Montgomery bawling, "Cooey, Moreau!" My arm became less painful, but very hot. I got feverish and thirsty. My shadow grew shorter. I watched the distant figure until it went away again. Would Moreau and Montgomery never return? 3 seabirds began fighting for some stranded treasure. Then, from far away behind the enclosure, I heard a pistol shot. A long silence, and then came another. Then a yelling cry nearer, and another dismal gap of silence. My unfortunate imagination set to work to torment me. Then, suddenly, a shot close by. I went to the corner, startled, and saw Montgomery, his face scarlet, his hair disordered, and the knee of his trousers torn. His face expressed profound consternation. Behind him slouched the beast-man, Embling, and round Emling's jaws were some queer dark stains. "Has he come?" said Montgomery. "Moreau?" said I. "No." "My God!" The man was panting, almost sobbing. "Go back in," he said, taking my arm. "They're mad. They're all rushing about mad. What can have happened? I don't know. I'll tell you when my breath comes. Where's some brandy?" Montgomery limped before me into the room and sat down in the deck-chair. Embling flung himself down just outside the doorway and began panting like a dog. I got Montgomery some brandy and water. He sat staring in front of him at nothing, recovering his breath. After some minutes He began to tell me what had happened. He had followed their track for some way. It was plain enough at first on account of the crushed and broken bushes, white rags torn from the puma's bandages, and occasional smears of blood on the leaves of the shrubs and undergrowth. He lost the track, however, on the stony ground beyond the stream where I had seen the beast man drinking, and went wandering aimlessly westward, shouting Moreau's name. Then M'ling had come to him carrying a little hatchet. M'ling had seen nothing of the puma affair, had been felling wood, and heard him calling. They went on shouting together. 2 beast-men came crouching and peering at them through the undergrowth, with gestures and a furtive carriage that alarmed Montgomery by their strangeness. He hailed them, and they fled guiltily. He stopped shooting after that, and after wandering some time farther, in an undecided way, determined to visit the huts. He found the ravine deserted. Growing more alarmed every minute, he began to retrace his steps. Then it was he encountered the 2 swine-men I had seen dancing on the night of my arrival. Blood-stained they were about the mouth, and intensely excited. They came crashing through the ferns, and stopped with fierce faces when they saw him. They cracked his whip in some trepidation, and forthwith they rushed at him. Never before had a beast-man dared to do that. One he shot through the head. M'ling flung himself upon the other, and the 2 rolled grappling. M'ling got his brute under and with his teeth in its throat, and Montgomery shot that too as it struggled in M'ling's grip. He had some difficulty in inducing M'ling to come on with him. Thence they hurried back to me. On the way, M'ling had suddenly rushed into a thicket and driven out an undersized ocelot man, also blood-stained and lame through a wound in the foot. This brute had run a little way and then turned savagely at bay, and Montgomery, with a certain wantonness, I thought, had shot him. "What does it all mean?" said I. He shook his head, and turned once more to the brandy. Chapter 18. The Finding of Moreau. When I saw Montgomery swallow a 3rd dose of brandy, I took it upon myself to interfere. He was already more than half fuddled. I told him that some serious thing must have happened to Moreau by this time, or he would have returned before this, and that it behooved us to ascertain what that catastrophe was. Montgomery raised some feeble objections, and at last agreed. We had some food, and then all 3 of us started. It is possibly due to the tension of my mind at the time, but even now that start into the hot stillness of the tropical afternoon is a singularly vivid impression. M'ling went first, his shoulder hunched, his strange black head moving with quick starts, as he peered first on this side of the way and then on that. He was unarmed. His axe he had dropped when he encountered the swine-man. Teeth were his weapons when it came to fighting. Montgomery followed with stumbling footsteps, his hands in his pockets, his face downcast. He was in a state of muddled sullenness with me on account of the brandy. My left arm was in a sling. It was lucky it was my left, and I carried my revolver in my right. Soon we traced a narrow path through the wild luxuriance of the island, going northwestward, and presently M'ling stopped and became rigid with watchfulness. Montgomery almost staggered into him, and then stopped too. Then, listening intently, we heard coming through the trees the sound of voices and footsteps approaching us. "He is dead," said a deep, vibrating voice. "He is not dead! He is not dead!" jabbered another. "We saw! We saw!" said several voices. "Hello!" suddenly shouted Montgomery. "Hello there!" "Confound you!" said I, and gripped my pistol. There was a silence, then a crashing among the interlacing vegetation, first here, then there, and then 6 faces appeared, strange faces, lit by a strange light. M'ling made a growling noise in his throat. I recognized the ape-man. I had indeed already identified his voice, and 2 of the white-swathed, brown-featured creatures I had seen in Montgomery's boat. With these were the 2 dappled brutes and that grey, horribly crooked creature who said the law, with grey hair streaming down his cheeks, heavy grey eyebrows, and grey locks pouring off from a central parting upon its sloping forehead. A heavy, faceless thing, with strange red eyes, looked at us curiously from amidst the green. For a space no one spoke. Then Montgomery hiccuped, "Who said he was dead?" The monkey man looked guiltily at the hairy grey thing. "He is dead," said this monster. They saw. There was nothing threatening about this detachment, at any rate. They seemed awe-stricken and puzzled. "Where is he?" said Montgomery. "Beyond," and the grey creature pointed. "Is there a law now?" asked the monkey man. "Is it still to be this and that? Is he dead indeed? Is there a law?" repeated the man in white. "Is there a law, thou other with the whip?" "He is dead," said the hairy grey thing, and they all stood watching us. "Prendick," said Montgomery, turning his dull eyes to me. "He's dead, evidently." I had been standing behind him during this colloquy. I began to see how things lay with them. I suddenly stopped in front of Montgomery and lifted up my voice. "Children of the law," I said, "he is not dead." Emling turned his sharp eyes on me. "He has changed his shape. He has changed his body," I went on. "For a time you will not see him. He is there," I pointed upward, "where he can watch you. You cannot see him, but he can see you. Fear the law." I looked at them squarely. They flinched. "He is great. He is good," said the ape-man, peering fearfully upward among the dense trees. "And the other thing?" I demanded. "The thing that bled and ran screaming and sobbing, that is dead too," said the grey thing, still regarding me. "That's well," grunted Montgomery. "The other, with the whip," began the grey thing. "Well," said I. "Said he was dead." But Montgomery was still sober enough to understand my motive in denying Moreau's death. "He is not dead," he said slowly. "Not dead at all. No more dead than I am. Some," said I, "have broken the law. They will die. Some have died. Show us now where his old body lies, the body he cast away because he had no more need of it." "It is this way, man who walked in the sea," said the grey thing. And with these 6 creatures guiding us, we went through the tumult of ferns and creepers and tree-stems towards the northwest. Then came a yelling, a crashing among the branches, and a little pink homunculus rushed by us shrieking. Immediately after appeared a monster in headlong pursuit, blood-bedabbled, who was amongst us almost before he could stop his career. The grey thing leapt aside. Emling, with a snarl, flew at it, and was struck aside. Montgomery fired and missed, bowed his head, threw up his arm, and turned to run. I fired, and the thing still came on. Fired again, point-blank into its ugly face. I saw its features vanish in a flash. Its face was driven in. Yet it passed me, gripped Montgomery, and holding him, fell headlong beside him, and pulled him sprawling upon itself in its death agony. I found myself alone with Emling, the dead brute, and the prostrate man. Montgomery raised himself slowly, and stared in a muddled way at the shattered beast-man beside him. It more than half sobered him. He scrambled to his feet. Then I saw the grey thing returning cautiously through the trees. "See," said I, pointing to the dead brute, "is the law not alive? This came of breaking the law." He peered at the body. "He sends the fire that kills," said he in his deep voice, repeating part of the ritual. The others gathered round and stared for a space. At last we drew near the westward extremity of the island. We came upon the gnawed and mutilated body of the puma, its shoulder-bone smashed by a bullet, and perhaps 20 yards farther found at last what we sought. Moreau lay face downward in a trampled space in a canebrake. One hand was almost severed at the wrist, and his silvery hair was dabbled in blood. His head had been battered in by the fetters of the puma. The broken canes beneath him were smeared with blood. His revolver we could not find. Montgomery turned him over. Resting at intervals, and with the help of the 7 Beast People, for he was a heavy man, we carried Moreau back to the enclosure. The night was darkling. Twice we heard unseen creatures howling and shrieking past our little band, and once the little pink sloth creature appeared and stared at us, and vanished again. But we were not attacked again. At the gates of the enclosure our company of Beast People left us, M'ling going with the rest. We locked ourselves in, and then took Moreau's mangled body into the yard and laid it upon a pile of brushwood. Then we went into the laboratory, and put an end to all we found living there. Chapter 19. Montgomery's Bank Holiday. When this was accomplished, and we had washed and eaten, Montgomery and I went into my little room and seriously discussed our position for the first time. It was then near midnight. He was almost sober, but greatly disturbed in his mind. He had been strangely under the influence of Moreau's personality. I do not think it had ever occurred to him that Moreau could die. This disaster was a sudden collapse of the habits that had become part of his nature in the 10 or more monotonous years he had spent on the island. He talked vaguely, answered my questions crookedly, wandered into general questions. "This silly ass of a world," he said. "What a muddle it all is! I haven't had any life. I wonder when it's going to begin. 16 years being bullied by nurses and schoolmasters at their own sweet will. 5 in London, grinding hard at medicine, bad food, shabby lodgings, shabby clothes, shabby vice. A blunder. I didn't know any better, and hustled off to this beastly island. 10 years here. What's it all for, Prendick? Are we bubbles blown by a baby?" It was hard to deal with such ravings. "The thing we have to think of now," said I, "is how to get away from this island." "What's the good of getting away? I'm an outcast. Where am I to join on? It's all very well for you, Prendick. Poor old Moreau. We can't leave him here to have his bones picked. As it is, and besides, what will become of the decent part of the beast folk?" "Well," said I, "that will do tomorrow. I've been thinking we might make the brushwood into a pyre and burn his body, and those other things. Then what will happen with the beast folk?" "I don't know. I suppose those that were made of beasts of prey will make silly asses of themselves sooner or later. We can't massacre the lot, can we? I suppose that's what your humanity would suggest. But they'll change. They are sure to change." He talked thus inconclusively until at last I felt my temper going. "Damnation!" he exclaimed at some petulance of mine. "Can't you see I'm in a worse hole than you are?" And he got up and went for the brandy. "Drink," he said, returning. "You logic-chopping, chalky-faced saint of an atheist, drink." "Not I," said I, and sat grimly watching his face under the yellow paraffin flare as he drank himself into garrulous misery. I have a memory of infinite tedium. He wandered into a maudlin defence of the Beast People and of M'ling. M'ling, he said, was the only thing that had ever really cared for him. And suddenly an idea came to him. "I'm damned," said he, staggering to his feet and clutching the brandy bottle. By some flash of intuition I knew what it was he intended. "You don't give drink to that beast," I said, rising and facing him. "Beast?" said he. "You're the beast. He takes his liquor like a Christian. Come out of my way, Prendick." "For God's sake," said I, "get out of the way," he roared, and suddenly whipped out his revolver. "Very well," said I, and stood aside, half-minded to fall upon him as he put his hand upon the latch, but deterred by the thought of my useless arm. "You've made a beast of yourself. To the beasts you may go." He flung the doorway open, and stood half-facing me between the yellow lamplight and the pallid glare of the moon. His eye-sockets were blotches of black under his stubbly eyebrows. "You're a solemn prig, Prendick, a silly ass. You're always fearing and fancying. We're on the edge of things. I'm bound to cut my throat tomorrow. I'm going to have a damned bank holiday tonight." He turned and went out into the moonlight. "Emling!" he cried. "Emling, old friend!" 3 dim creatures in the silvery light came along the edge of the wan beach, one a white-wrapped creature, the other 2 blotches of blackness following it. They halted, staring. Then I saw Emling's hunched shoulders as he came round the corner of the house. "Drink!" cried Montgomery. "Drink, you brutes! Drink and be men! Damn me, I'm the cleverest. Moreau forgot this. This is the last touch. Drink, I tell you!" And waving the bottle in his hand, he started off at a kind of quick trot to the westward, Emling ranging himself between him and the 3 dim creatures who followed. I went to the doorway. They were already indistinct in the mist of the moonlight before Montgomery halted. I saw him administer a dose of the raw brandy to Emling, and saw the 5 figures melt into one vague patch. "Sing!" I heard Montgomery shouting. "Sing! Shout! Sing all together! Confound old Prendick! That's right! Now again! Confound old Prendick!" The black group broke up into 5 separate figures, and wound slowly away from me along the band of shining beach. Each went howling at his own sweet will, yelping insults at me, or giving whatever other vent this new inspiration of brandy demanded. Presently I heard Montgomery's voice shouting, "Right turn!" and they passed with their shouts and howls into the blackness of the landward trees. Slowly, very slowly, they receded into silence. The peaceful splendor of the night healed again. The moon was now past the meridian and travelling down the west. It was at its full, and very bright riding through the empty blue sky. The shadow of the wall lay, a yard wide and of inky blackness, at my feet. The eastward sea was a featureless grey, dark and mysterious, and between the sea and the shadow the grey sands, of volcanic glass and crystals, flashed and shone like a beach of diamonds. Behind me the paraffin lamp flared hot and ruddy. Then I shut the door, locked it, and where Moreau lay beside his latest victims, the staghounds and the llama, and some other wretched brutes, with his massive face calm even after his terrible death, and with the hard eyes open, staring at the dead white moon above. I sat down upon the edge of the sink, and with my eyes upon that ghastly pile of silvery light and ominous shadows, began to turn over my plans. In the morning I would gather some provisions in the dinghy, and, after setting fire to the pyre before me, push out into the desolation of the high sea once more. I felt that for Montgomery there was no help, that he was, in truth, half akin to these beast-folk, unfitted for human kindred. I do not know how long I sat there scheming. It must have been an hour or so. Then my planning was interrupted by the return of Montgomery to my neighbourhood. I heard a yelling from many throats, a tumult of exultant cries passing down towards the beach, whooping and howling, and excited shrieks that seemed to come to a stop near the water's edge. The riot rose and fell. I heard heavy blows and the splintering smash of wood, but it did not trouble me then. A discordant chanting began. My thoughts went back to my means of escape. I got up, brought the lamp, and went into a shed to look at some kegs I had seen there. Then I became interested in the contents of some biscuit tins, and opened one. I saw something out of the tail of my eye, a red figure, and turned sharply. Behind me lay the yard, vividly black and white in the moonlight, and the pile of wood and faggots on which Moreau and his mutilated victims lay, one over another. They seemed to be gripping one another in one last revengeful grapple. His wounds gaped, black as night, and the blood that had dripped lay in black patches upon the sand. Then I saw, without understanding, the cause of my phantom, a ruddy glow that came and danced and went upon the wall opposite.